Okay, so we are recording. Welcome, welcome. Today we have Kasturi Torchia on the podcast. I'm very, very excited to talk to her. Very thankful for you coming on, especially as we barely know each other. And I briefly haggled you in London about a year ago and tried to pick your brains on a few things. So I'm excited to have you here, and thank you again at such short notice. So we will start really with your take on coaching. And I know that you work for a company called Esprit Concrete, and I wanted to know more about them because I feel like you guys have been growing over the last couple of years, but I don't know a lot of the ins and outs of how you coach and how maybe your approach differs from other coaches. So if could you explain a little bit
Okay, so
about Esprit?
first, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Um, and I think haggling is always good, especially when you're training alongside other people. It's so Esprit Concrete has been growing more in terms of the delivery pathways and who we provide for and how many people kind of connect with the service, but we're actually a really small team, so we've stayed a really small team.
Sure.
We're only 6 people if we include my lovely accountant. So there's a very family feel to Esprit Concrete, and although we work a lot, we're not actually that big. We don't have a hub, in the sense that we don't have a premises or anything like that. We do have therapy quarters because, as I'll explain in a minute, we do combine our work with therapy, and that is the place that we rent. But other than that, we don't really have an HQ. So a lot of things are done from our homes. A lot of things are done just private practice style. And I think that provides us flexibility. It also allows us to save a bit more, to reinvest in our team and in our growth. But it's definitely something that we want to look at. So what we essentially do is we work off a model that is created off the back of research that I did for my PhD. It's doctoral training, but PhD level. And that's counseling psychology. And this model started out really loose, just trying to go off the back of a hunch that actually therapy processes and therapy journeys for individuals seem to be quite similar to certain, at the time, parkour, and then what I later found out was my understanding more of arti déplacement pathways. And the mirroring of this for me was just interesting from day one. So even before I really knew what I was doing, as I was jumping, for me that process was really a parallel. So I figured out that actually I needed to be a bit more specific, and we found a way of conceptualizing lack of progression within parkour to reverse that into a way to progress in parkour. And the reason I say in parkour is because most of the people that we work with do practice parkour. They don't practice or self-identify with practicing arti déplacement. But the reason I use arti déplacement is because the Yamak trained us, and the philosophy behind ADD is what informed the actual package coaching delivery. So what we use to teach is arti déplacement and therapy, but who we provide for is any practitioner. So it's more an idea that it doesn't mean that an Esprit Concrete method class is for people practicing ADD, but our methodology and our philosophy stems from arti déplacement. And what we tried to do is we tried to create a picture of an individual with them about who they are within a context of movement, to also try to match that up to who they are just generally in real life. And the reason I say real life is that over the years, I've kind of noticed that sometimes there's a bit of a bubble around training, and it's very easy to get a persona or a methodology that really works to contain a lot of things in training. But then when you're not training, it's not always directly transferable, the things that you do in training, to real life. So in my thesis, I call it the training self versus the real self. And I saw great potential in trying to kind of bring those two together. And in doing so, we find that we're actually working on trying to get that person to really reach their own social, emotional, psychological self in order to not only improve their movement, reduce likelihood of injury, reduce dropout rates, that kind of thing, but also then translate that into the relationships that they have at work or at home, or what their aspirations are, working on self-esteem, depression, anxiety, whatever it may be. So Esprit Concrete is a specialist service if it needs to be. So we do work with very specialist communities and services where mental health is the primary focus, and getting back to the part of the spectrum that is mental well-being that's healthy is where we target our intervention. But it's also just there for normalizing the fact that this kind of intervention that combines therapy with movement is for everyone. And that's the part that's a bit tricky. So a lot of the time, people ask me why I use the word therapy in what I do. And for me, normalization of therapy is a really big personal agenda. I don't feel like it's a thing that's seen enough as a preventative practice. I feel like it's seen as a cure. And that concept for me is pretty disturbing, because I don't find that my clients need curing. I feel like we're just trying to better understand how things work in order to make them work the way we want them to. So this process, I would imagine, is quite a human process. And counseling psychology very much stems from this humanistic ethos that is really in line with after déplacement, parkour, and free running for some people. For some people, it's just a sport, but for other people, it is also a lifestyle, an approach to an obstacle. And for me, those things really match up.
Absolutely, that's super. I think it's spot on there with just the term therapy, because I think so many people seem to be put off by even the idea of therapy just because it feels like something that's urgent and very vulnerable and very kind of like you only do it when you really need it. It's not. But like you say, I think that's actually a really important idea, to be able to normalize the word therapy, because as you said, it can be a preventative practice. So you mentioned the Yamak as well, and that's super interesting for me, just because I'm a big parkour nerd. I know most things about parkour, but I'm always trying to learn more, and I'm especially interested in the founders and the origins of parkour. So has that connection with the Yamak stemmed from Yao, who's a part of Esprit as well?
So Gogo Liao is the co-founder. He's also my life partner. In actual fact, no. So it's quite an interesting story, and it mirrors a bit of my veganism journey from my parents.
Okay.
My mom's South African Indian and my dad's Italian. But so when I tell people that I'm vegan, they're often quite convinced that my mum made my dad vegan, because Indians used to tend to eat less meat, whereas it was the other way around. So in this similar situation, Yao, I met through Parkour Generations. And although he definitely had this kind of organic connection with some of the Yamak, he really started to get to know them when my interest in them grew, as I was doing a semester in Denmark. So in Denmark, at Gerlo, they have an exchange kind of agreement with the Yamak, where they take the students for 10 days or something like that to Paris. And initially, my first meeting with them had been at a rendezvous or a winterval with Parkour Generations. And I had seen Jan beginning to deliver this workshop that everyone seemed very perplexed by. And for some reason, completely unknown to me, everything about what was happening in that session truly connected with me. And I began to translate what I felt he meant for him. So anyone who you speak to, even in France, will tell you that even in French, Jan is quite difficult to understand sometimes. Sure. It's a running joke that we all have. It's very true. But it's because he's very metaphorical in the way that he speaks. So everything is a representation. And I think that's where my psychology comes in as well, because I work a lot with symbolism. So when I heard him speak, just hair raising, and I just connected with his visualizations and his way of delivering this very experiential moment that you couldn't quite comprehend at the time, but that was okay because you may get it 3 years down the line. So I immediately kind of chatted to him, and he just said to me, "You're very special. I think we're gonna meet again," which I thought was quite interesting. And I just said to him, "I think you seem like you're a little bit sad right now, but actually in a period of change." And he said that he was going through a lot of changes himself. So we had this really brief, tiny chat, very powerful. And then I saw him again and met Chow when I went with the Denmark crew, so Street Movement Gala. Having spent a bit more time there, I also had initially, before I went to Gallo, met Williams on the Croatia tour. I think it's called Motion Tour. Not sure they still do it, but I had done a tour there. And I'd gotten really badly injured on one of my jumps that I was attempting far too soon for my readiness. And I realized in that moment that actually Williams had gauged that there was probably something that was going to go wrong, but I was so adamant to do it. There was nothing actually he could do. And out of nowhere, not even being the person delivering that session, he just appeared on the rooftop that I fell into, and he caught me from falling down. So there's just been a series of very weird events that have kind of brought us together. And since then, we've just connected on the idea that I kind of regurgitate almost what they've been trying to say and communicate just through embodiment into vocabulary and communication and talk. And then when I started to have this idea for Esprit Concrete, they were really supportive, and they didn't really understand it at first. I didn't even understand it myself. We weren't sure if we were moving too far away from Art de Placement. I had to present my ideas to them. But they've now become like family, and we spend a lot of time with them, just with their families. They're like my second family. So Yao followed through with that journey. So he would say he kind of got to know what Art de Placement is through me and my interest. But of course, Yao knows so many people from all his decade of training that it was kind of inevitable that I met them, even if it wasn't,
Sure.
at that.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was doing my level 2 qualification in London, Yao was assisting, well, and kind of overwatching Chris Keithley as I did. So I met Yao through that, and I find it. Do you think that Esprit, in a sense, is therefore an extension of the original practice?
So there are a lot of terms at the moment for the different disciplines that for me all come under this umbrella that the Yamak call Yamakasi. So even if you go to Paris now, they just say, "Oh, Yamakasi."
Yeah,
And that was the name of the practice, which a lot of people don't actually know because it doesn't ring that way here. So I think when we first started, I definitely saw it as the ADD plus almost, in terms of psychologically deep diving into the potential that Art de Placement has and making it accessible to people who maybe do either prefer or could do with externalizing some of the process. So instead of just doing it through the movement and having it movement specific and waiting maybe 5 or 10 years to really have those epiphany moments about your training, which is brilliant, and it's very martial arts kind of driven. I wanted to try to extend that and also speed it up in case people in crisis at the beginning really needed it. And when I say in crisis, I just mean an athlete, wants to make money from this, has hit a roadblock or has been injured, can't quite get over it, and they're strapped for cash and they're strapped for time. And what happens? Who's going to help them through that process? So for me, there was a niche there. So yes, I would say it's an extension of Art de Placement. the Yamak that I do work with also see it as a off route from ADD.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's definitely where it's headed.
Mm-hmm. Because I'd say that for the majority of parkour practitioners at the moment, this isn't in any detriment to ADD or what you're doing, but I think that the vast majority would actually struggle to know what ADD meant, or actually understood that some people still call it Yamakasi or ADD and this sort of thing. So do you worry that the parkour community in its evolution is losing some of these ideas and values?
So I think there's a few parts to that kind of question, and it's a really good one that's just constantly being debated now. And I'm hoping,
Yeah.
try as much as possible to do my bit over the next few years to try to spread what Art du Déplacement actually is. So working with the founders who are still here, to get them to really identify that. They were very conflict and confrontation averse. So there wasn't a popularization, a stepping up of actually disseminating what Art du Déplacement really was. And because it's quite a personalized journey, there was this tendency for the Yamak to definitely sit back and kind of allow people to just find their own Art du Déplacement. The positive of that is that it's very transformational. The cost of that is that obviously it doesn't become worldwide spread like parkour did or freerunning.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that that's a cost? I don't think so, but I do think it needs work. So I think education needs to be brought in quite strongly. The reason being that I think for me, psychology is about everything, the past, the present, and the future, and understanding how all those things kind of interlock and interchange. And therefore, the potential of someone's practice, for me, is enlightened if they do understand the root potential of the practice, which needs
Mm-hmm.
to kind of involve the history of how was this conceptualized, what were they intending. And I think what the parkour community sometimes now is missing is this driving question that underlies most of Art du Déplacement, as I understand it anyway, which is, what is your motivation? So if you speak to Laurent, if you speak to Chow, if you speak to Williams, they may disagree on a lot of things, but they find commonality in this idea that they all are training to find out why they're training. And this underlying question is really psychologically bound for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's very existential. It's the closest question to why are we here, kind of, for me, why are you here in this moment? What is it for you? So I think learning about that and learning about how the movement can help you tap into trying to answer that question would be really useful for people to know. And in order to do that, they do need access to understanding what ADD is and what the history is. So I do think that they may be losing some of the process, but because, a lot of the search is quite driven by the individual, people who practice parkour who don't know what ADD is, somehow they're still finding their way to similar values that do stem from Art du Déplacement, but stem even beyond that. So all the values that we see in the ADD practice come from family values that the founders had, idealism, certain aspirations of helping others, their belief of who they are in this world and why they're here and what can they do with it. And a lot of the parkour community find that without knowing the term ADD. It just would be nice to credit a process that I feel was crystallized somehow, but not shared and not disseminated, because, again, communication just wasn't there. It's really hard for a group of people who also, they would self-admit that they didn't come from education. They didn't come from any kind of self-esteem that was high enough to think we're going to change the world. That wasn't their aim. And therefore their dream was just, whoever we can touch with this, awesome. And if not, then not. But they knew deep down there was something quite rich here. So I think some people capitalized on the publicity and media and all of that, and others didn't. And it would be really nice to see a bit more of that, because they do have quite a few philosophies that I think would help training in general for practitioners today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as parkour evolves, I always think it's fascinating because it's so young that we can literally look back and understand some of the ways in which it has developed. And I think there are, from what I can see, I was speaking to one of my other guests about this. From what I can see, there are quite a few mental health problems within the parkour community, and there is, I would say, a prevalence of listlessness and kind of looseness that maybe comes with being so free and wanting to do something so free. And I think that, yeah, I see it in, simple things like Instagram stories and sharing content. And there are some people who are finding things difficult. So yeah, I wanted to ask you how you, I mean, it's obviously, it would take you a long time to explain fully, but how, in some ways, do you help the people that you teach? And how, for example, Georgia Monroe, who I know that you kind of, is it a kind of a mentorship type scheme? Because I remember seeing you with her in London, and I thought it was really interesting that you were kind of projecting kind of encouraging ideas to her while she was training. And that's something that I haven't seen much before in that way in the parkour community. There's kind of general encouragement, but I remember you were kind of talking through her thought processes. So is that something that's kind of a basis in your teaching?
Yes, so I get so excited when I think about this, and I haven't been at work for a week, so I'm a bit I'm a bit tense. But
Right.
yes, so in order for me to do that, I'm just going to quickly highlight the process of what happens in a therapy session, just because I want the parallel to be kind of clear to anyone who maybe has never tried therapy or doesn't know what it is. So over the course of a few sessions, you form this kind of understanding of how triggers affect certain people,
Sure.
and what kind of behaviors come out of those scenarios. The difference, because I work quite integratively and I use quite a lot of kind of past, present, future amalgamations within context, is that I try to find out whether that person wants to actually identify what their defenses are to certain situations, and what kind of coping strategies they enlist that they may not even be aware of. So things like what you were saying before about how free this all is, it's very, very appealing for people who also like to avoid things. So running away often becomes a great tactic, and parkour has this really great invigorating or almost hero empowering moment in someone's life where when they're training, they're actually the person they want to be. And then they go back to reality and it's all a bit depressing. This is obviously a very big stereotype. Not everyone's situation is like this. It's just an example. But with Georgia, for example, when she first came and told me that she wanted to work for me, it was important that she see it, if she could connect with the process herself. So all our coaches practice the method. If they don't, that would be kind of peculiar to be delivering it. So if it doesn't click with them, or if they don't find that they want to then teach that, they would leave, basically. So the idea being that you have to really be authentic and true to understanding the process by being in it yourself, to be able to really see what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. So for her, she has certain things that we realized she was working on, that are linked to her personality, that would get her into training patterns that either kept her away from certain things or pushed her towards training certain things. So she would specialize in jumping, for example. And the jumping in and of itself and a big jump represented something to her that actually meant a lot more than just a big jump, but actually a lot of repression being a female with a big jump. And what that represented to her came from way before she met parkour. So when we trace it back, we get to understand what function that behavior in training is having. And if we want to work with it, because maybe it's holding us back or it's restrictive or we just don't like it very much, we can actually tweak the training style. So what we train, how long we train it for, what kind of moves we do to target challenging this idea that we have of ourselves within this example. So the feedback comes from this mental map that she has and I have of her working processes, her internal working models. And those models she's trying to challenge because she wants to get to wherever she wants to get to. And I would prompt her as she goes along, because a lot of them were initially unconscious completely. They're now subconscious, and they're not always going to come to the forefront when you're training. So sometimes she'll get super frustrated with certain things, and it is because she is reverting back to exactly the same style of practice she had when she first met me, for example, which is completely normal. We all do it. So we all have our cues that we give each other in a team. And if I can just prompt her with a question that is an exploratory question, she gets re-triggered to think, oh yes, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. So actually I'm going to change this and I'm going to try this. And she usually ends up getting the jump or whatever it is that she wants. But that's kind of a process that is very instant gratification based. In the long run, she needs the prompting a lot less. And she's able to then coach people or identify certain kind of patterns in their own training that allows her to then probe that without going into too much of the psychology, because that is what I would do, or hopefully in the future what another therapist would do when we get one in. Not sure if that answers your question, but
that's all fascinating. Yeah, don't worry too much. I found it really interesting at the moment with the lockdown situation and how people are training as well, because a lot of people have been revisiting solo practice, which seems to have been less popular over the last few years, myself included. And there was an example recently where I had this new arm jump that I found, and I was by myself, and I really got into a state of stress and anxiety about trying to get this arm jump done. And there's quite a few reasons, partly because I was by myself, so if something happened, then I wouldn't have any help. Partly because I felt that I might not have too much opportunity left to try this jump, if you follow me, as in I was in a location where within the next few months it might not be accessible, and yeah, a few other things. And it was really I keep using the word interesting, but I'm gonna have to keep using it. It was really interesting for me to then only recently go back with a friend, and you know, we trained together, social distancing and everything, but he broke the jump next to me, and it was just, it showed me, because I haven't trained with people for so long, it showed me how powerful having someone with you is on your whole mental state. And I managed to break the jump, and I felt, you know, elated and everything. But in a sense, I talked to him afterwards, and I was like, I kind of want to go back by myself and do it by myself now, because I know it's physically possible for me. I always knew it was physically possible for me, but having that help kind of was the push that I needed, really. So do you do a mixture of, yeah, how with Georgia, for example, how do you think you will tail off the amount of, I guess, support and encouragement? How does that work?
A little bit like therapy, there are usually endings. a little bit different to therapy. We're a team. So the family dynamic that we have, you never really stop being part of Esprit Concrete. So we had somebody who was working with us called Jasper, and we still keep in touch about his training or whatever it may be, because the systemic support system that we're trying to establish is really important to us. So just in terms of community growth, community engagement, staying connected, that feeling of belongingness, people actually really knowing what your training is, we try to keep that up. The only difference is the intensity. So obviously the people who work with us, they're very lucky. They get this as part of their package, and we're very lucky because then they use that package to then give back to us through their coaching or whatever it may be. But even when I do events and things like that, there's always a 6 to 12 month period where people can have sessions with me afterwards, or they can have Skype sessions to discuss the process that they particularly found touched them, so that there is some kind of closure within a part of that delivery that has been had. With Georgia, there isn't going to be an end because she's part of our family, if that makes sense. But what is happening now is a little bit like a graduation where you kind of feel like you are a bit more in the know of holding those working models that you have of yourself, which means that she may just send me a text and say, I felt this, I think it's got to do with this because it kind of reminds me of this. What do you think about that? And I would just feed back a question saying, well, you've just explained it. What do you think about that? Is there anything to challenge that? And that's kind of it. And then her process unravels. And she's already kind of at that stage. The only difference is, I think, for what you were saying, for example, the lone training versus the other. In my thesis, what came out of the grounded theory was the process that I ended up calling contained practitioning, which is a practitioner who kind of had this reflective pathway that is very, very active, that really understands the function of the group within their individual practice. Because a lot of what came out was how important individual practice is, but also how collective practice is so empowering and engaging and constructive. But not kind of losing yourself to what comes up in another process, which is almost a cultish dependency on the group. So within this process, there is a really interesting psychological process that I talk about, which is a little bit like a sharing of autonomy. So you come in with yourself and you kind of need a custodian who believes in you more than you believe in yourself. And for a small moment, you kind of give that up a little bit. And that energy that people describe of seeing somebody else doing it, I believe is very much that self-belief in yourself you don't have. And we all have less self-esteem than we would like. So there isn't anyone that I know that, as a human, we are vulnerable. So this energy that you feel of course I can do it because I know I can mentally, I know that I can physically do it, but mentally I'm not quite there. And you see someone rush and you're like, yes, that's what I needed. I'm going to follow that energy and do it. Is a really healthy process that, as you said, needs to then maybe be questioned about, okay, so what was it that made me feel like I needed something extra? Why wasn't I just enough? And that's the process that the Esprit Concrete method works with, so that whether you're with people or not, what you want to achieve from your potential is more accessible. It's not to say that we're saying that you will reach your ultimate potential and self-actualize, and that's not what we're talking about, but it is marrying that guide and really acknowledging how useful peers, mentors, teachers, coaches, whoever it is, because also that mirrors what maybe you didn't have as a support system much earlier on. So a lot of people come into parkour and actually the guides and the older generations are really important to them because they provide a structure that they didn't have or they didn't feel they had when they were much younger. There's still a growing up phase, even through training. And once you kind of emancipate yourself from that, you're then an adult who actually knows when to ask for help and when not. And before that point, you're kind of like a child who does need hand holding a little bit, and that's okay. A little bit like when you're spotting. Sometimes you have to spot quite rigorously, and then you pull it back, and that person just takes off, you know. But it's the teaching that person that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to check in with your process. It's okay to not suddenly be able to do a jump, even if you've been training 10 years and you should be able to, because maybe it's just an ongoing iterative process of growth.
Wow. Yeah. I think, yeah, man, that's just like, it's lighting up my brain. That's such an important message. I think that there's such a, you know, we do talk about the mental side and the physical side of parkour. I think the physical side has been and is still being thoroughly explored. But the mental, there's so much more, I think. And I hope that people who are watching this, or people who understand this type of message, can try and relay it, because you're right in that there's such power in being able to enact what you want to enact, and having the mental capacity to do that, and how much, I guess, self esteem that can provide, and also just a sense of fulfillment. So yeah, that's more power to you. That's really something that needs to be shared within parkour a lot more. I wonder whether, I mean, this we could go on talking for a long time about this, but I wonder whether, my suspicion is that, you know, parkour is predominantly male, and I worry that in that sense there are intrinsic barriers to helping the community as a whole, and to I guess being perhaps more open-minded to different approaches. I don't. I think this would be a conversation for another time. But yeah, I wonder whether we do need to. What would help a lot of people is exactly what you're saying. You know, this kind of different approach, this introspective approach, that maybe for some men who do parkour is a little bit, you know, wishy-washy or soft, or they perceive it in that way, so therefore they don't go down that alleyway, so to speak. So yeah, we could speak on that another time, but I guess yeah, we're going through quickly. I wanted to ask you more a bit about you, actually, for the next kind of section. So
Another time, but just a little sentence about that. I think it's also about the great thing about the Esprit Concrete method is that it isn't a one-fit-all model. It's designed with the person in mind, because each person is individual and different and unique. So, for example, when I train with a lot of the younger generation, not very, very young now, but if we're thinking about, you know, Eric Moore, Joe Scandrett, that kind of realm, Silka, and Silka made an interesting person to talk to, because she spent a week with me, and
really,
she's been in touch ever since. And and she coaches at one of my events. But we've tried, Yao and I, to also just mentor her through smaller pockets of time, just because we want more athletes to understand what we do, to try to engage them a little bit more and not have them scared of this therapeutic approach, I guess. So it would be interesting for you to talk to her maybe about this. But the way to get to a lot of people who perhaps are a bit more resistant, because they do have a predisposed idea of what therapy is or what talking is, or is actually to make it goal orientated. So a lot of people want the jump, and they love the feeling that they get when they have the jump. There's no reason why we can't work that way around. So a lot of the time when people come to classes, we're not starting with this huge understanding of the self. We're just starting from showing them that there are little keys to actually getting a bigger jump, or getting a faster reaction time, or a faster commitment time. And that's definitely one of the ways in that we do use to retain people who come in a bit kind of doubtful, that we learnt through failed workshops, where we went in with the thinking, and then people were sort of a bit put off or a bit scared, because there's a lot of fear around exploring oneself in that way as well, and it has to be something that people buy into. But with the male perspective, it's really interesting because at the moment there's a huge move for mental health awareness and mental health and well-being. I guess I don't want to use the word propaganda because it sounds really negative, but it kind of is everywhere at the moment. And I think there's a vast difference between that and really being honest about the journey of finding out who you are. So there's definitely a step in the right direction for being more open about sharing, but I think it actually needs to start just with small things like cultural norms when you're training, of just when you ask somebody, how are you? Instead of saying, yeah, good man. Like, no, like, how are you this week? You know, just tiny things. That way, asking a question isn't so weird. Having a question answered isn't so weird. And it doesn't mean you're not training. Because that's the other thing that people confuse Esprit Concrete method with, is I've heard people say, you know, you guys don't really train, you talk. Okay. Well, if you see many of our athletes, that's obviously a preconception of therapy. So I think the talking and how you integrate it and normalize it, just talking, really talking, is probably a good way to try to get more people involved. Actually, we found that people are really open to it, whether they are male, female, young, older, but you just need to meet them where they're at. And in order to do that, you need to have more people also coming to you, which is kind of tricky, as you say.
Yeah. So could you go into a bit of detail about you and about your own practice in parkour?
Yeah. So I practice art du déplacement. That is what I do. I found parkour first, and for me there is a clear difference between parkour and art du déplacement. I was very, very invigorated by parkour movement. The way that parkour was taught by parkour generations at the time, for example, made it very easy for me to see linearity. So this idea of progression. And you could feel like you were flying really fast, basically. So I felt like I was picking up these skills that I never knew or thought my body could do. And it was really almost overpowering sometimes because it didn't quite match up to who I really was at the time. So I had a lot of things that held me back without me knowing, a lot of overcompensations, a lot of shyness, a lot of things I had to work through. And I became very fixated on progress and on getting that bigger jump or becoming, even at one point thinking about becoming an athlete at a time where I was doing a doctorate in a subject I completely love. So there was a real identity kind of moment for me in my training at the beginning. And I was improving very fast at a time when not a lot of women were training. So there was a lot of hustle and bustle around that time. But actually, when I moved away from that, I realized that it was the injury that I had that made me change my training style. So sadly, on one end, the injury cost me a lot of conviction in what otherwise was kind of an avoidant, just jump mentality. And the reason I say it cost me that is because there's a certain freeness to that I was experiencing, where I was very brave. But actually I wasn't brave because I'd consider myself more brave now because I'm informed. So now I know exactly that I'm scared, and yet I do it. Whereas before, I would convince myself I wasn't scared and that everything was fine, which for me isn't actually bravery, and it cost me breaking a wrist. So I think it's more delusional is what I would call myself at that time for a certain portion of my training. And so in a lot of different ways, also just because of my age, I mean, I'm 32, I found it 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago. So I don't train as much as I would like to train, because I would love to train every day. But I am primarily a psychologist. I'm also primarily a researcher, mental health lead for Parkour UK. I am now going to be a mum. There's a lot of stuff going on. But when I do train, I try to really have quite focused training. So I train conceptually, I don't train movement. So if, for example, I'm training flow, there will be states of constant moving for a really long time in completely different positions that actually stop my flow. But until I feel like I'm gaining the confidence to be upside down within that space, for example. So I'm not very movement focused. I'm not actually at all movement focused. But I also have preferred movements. Like I love my passage in parkour called the Kong. And I can drill those all day. Like I don't get bored. It's quite incredible because I don't think I do that with anything else. But I could literally do that all day. So I think I know that my tendency to specialize is really strong because I have a part of me that's a perfectionist, that has perfectionist traits. And that means that I could spend all day trying to just get a much better Kong precision, a much better sharp price. And I challenge that a lot because I want to tackle my vulnerabilities. And my vulnerabilities are everything backwards, for example, everything upside down. So my strive for training is to be as all-round as possible. And because I only get two times a week roughly to train, I try and really focus in on mixing and matching a bit of everything. So that one training session kind of has quite a bit of everything in it. Yeah, I've never really had a problem training by myself. It just doesn't really happen that often. I think because I'm always with Yao, but Yao and I have very different training styles and we have a very different approach to training. And my Esprit Concrete method I use on myself just instinctually. So I have quite consistent training. And I manage my mood very differently to how I did 6 years ago. So I don't really have highs and lows in my training anymore, which is, yeah, it sounds bizarre to say, but what I mean by that is I'm constantly self-managing in the session. So I'm forcing the fact that I don't have highs and lows. So I may go in with a bad mood, or I may have a bad mood, or I may get frustrated, but the regulation process is quite clear. So whatever I want to attain from that training feels a lot more accessible. And if I can't attain it, there's a certain level of acceptance that's very kind, whereas before it was really punitive, and it was that fear of, well, now I've wasted this, or I don't have all my life to learn this, or do you know what I mean? There was a lot of stress, and now there's a lot less.
Absolutely. I think that's something that I need to focus on myself, and I'm sure a lot of people watching or listening would think about that as well. We're coming now to the end. I did think of one question in my head, but I don't know how useful it actually is. But I was going to ask you if there was one aspect of people's training that they could employ to assist their mental process, what do you think it would be? And yeah, again, I don't think that's a very good question, but if there's one kind of piece of mental health advice or mental approach to training that you think would help more people, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it's a bad question at all. I think it's a really good question, and it's one that is a little bit like a pocket tool. And if we simplify all of Esprit Concrete method into just the most basic cognitive behavioral therapy stream, which we also use in, first, are you a thinker, a feeler, or a behavioral doer? So those three things, just ask yourself which one you are. So does the thought come first, the feeling first, or the behavior? And if you can identify which one, then work your way back to make sure you're asking yourself about the other three. So when you do something in training and it feels incredible, what do you think about what you've done? And then why did it take that behavior to think about what you felt? Do you see what I mean? Like just work your way back so that you're constantly touching base with how you are acting, what may be going through your head, and what the feeling is. Because sometimes we'll be able to find discrepancies within that actually make us stop and think and say, well, actually, that didn't feel that great. Or actually, I feel like I needed that. Why did I need that? Or just make us a bit more quizzical. But instead of just saying, ask questions, just really asking 3 questions. Why did I behave like that? So when people often get shinned, for example, the process of understanding why you got shinned is often simplified, in my experience from training with people, to the physicality that you over or under jumped something, or the object itself did something, or those things are true. But very rarely do they come back to what decision you made that led to that overpower. So the function of the overpower would be, maybe you didn't actually think you'd make it.
Mm-hmm.
Why was it then that you chose to overjump instead of practice bounce off? If you don't think you're going to make it, maybe you could just practice a bounce off. Mm-hmm. But maybe bouncing off is scary because you're somebody who actually likes to throw themselves forward. You behave first. So you threw yourself and then you shinned. Do you see what I mean? Well, there's just a conversation with yourself that can be had if you just think about how you feel, how you think, and what are you doing? Like, what is your body doing? And maybe you won't get anywhere, and that's why, communities like Esprit Concrete exist, and other people training who do also ask these questions but don't call it anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then reaching out to other people with that.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think we'll come to an end there. Big thank you. Thank you so much, Kasturi. That was really fascinating, and something that I think has a lot of potential to help a lot of people in parkour. So I really thank you for your time, and hopefully we can spread this. I can spread this video far and wide and get more people thinking about these ideas. I'll put all of Kasturi and Esprit Concrete's links down in the description, so go and have a look there if you're watching. If you want to reach out to Kasturi, I'll also put her Instagram links and things like that there. But yeah, from me, thank you so much, and hopefully
Thank you, Sam. And I think, we were talking about education and spreading the word, and it's only with people who, are interested and giving their time like you're giving now, that we actually do share. And before this, when you were talking about connecting different coaching streams and connecting people together with what they do, I think it's really incredible that that's what you're trying to do, and you're just volunteering that. So I really hope that more people, take you up on your offer to talk to them and watch each other's work and meet people, not just virtually, but actually make the effort to go to places and try to train with different people, regardless of whether they believe in it or not. Just giving it a go. Hashtag give parkour a go, hashtag give ADD a go, hashtag give anything a go, so thank you for the opportunity to share.
You're welcome. Okay, well, stay well. Thank you so much again, and hopefully we can train sometime soon.
Awesome.
Okay.